Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever caught yourself thinking something like, I always mess things up, or they didn't reply, I must have done something wrong? It might seem harmless in the moment, but what if I told you these thoughts are not facts, they're distortions? Subtle lies, quiet manipulations of your reality, happening inside your own mind. Today, let's explore one of the most fascinating and dangerous psychological phenomena: cognitive distortions. Our mind is a storyteller. Every second, it's weaving narratives about ourselves, about others, about the world. Most of these stories run on autopilot. You don't stop to question them because they feel real. But feeling real doesn't always mean being true. This is where cognitive distortions come in. Cognitive distortions are automatic, irrational thought patterns that we all develop over time. They aren't signs of mental illness. They're signs of being human. But when left unchecked, they can quietly shape how you view your relationships, your self-worth, your failures, and even your future. They are mental shortcuts, or what psychologists call thinking errors. Imagine you're walking through a maze, blindfolded, and your brain is whispering directions in your ear. That voice is fast, confident, and often wrong. It's trying to protect you, yes, but it does so by making assumptions, not seeking the truth. These distortions often begin early in life, shaped by experiences, upbringing, trauma, fear, and repeated emotional reactions. Maybe someone criticized you constantly as a child, and now your mind overreacts to any feedback. Or maybe you grew up in a chaotic environment, so now your brain catastrophizes, always expecting the worst, even in peaceful moments. But here's the thing: cognitive distortions aren't always dramatic. In fact, they're usually quiet. That's what makes them dangerous. You might not notice when you're telling yourself, I always fail, or nobody really cares about me, or this one mistake proves I'm not good enough. These thoughts slide by undetected, like whispers in the background of your consciousness, until one day you start living according to them. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine you send a message to someone and they don't respond. A neutral event, right? But your brain jumps in. They must be ignoring me. I probably annoyed them. Maybe they're mad at me. I always mess things up. Within seconds, a spiral forms, and none of it is based on actual evidence. This is how distortion works. It takes a small trigger and filters it through fear, past pain, and false assumptions. The result? A narrative that feels emotionally true, but is logically flawed. It's also important to know that these patterns tend to repeat. The more you fall into them, the more your brain normalizes them. Over time, they become your default lens, coloring how you see yourself, how you handle failure, and how you connect with others. What began as a protective habit can evolve into a toxic mindset. And the worst part, you don't even realize it's happening. You might assume your thoughts are neutral, just observations about the world. But psychology tells us otherwise. Thoughts are not facts. They're interpretations. And interpretations can be wrong, especially when they come from a brain shaped by fear, trauma, rejection, or insecurity. This doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. In fact, cognitive distortions are universal. Everyone, even the most logical people, experiences them. Whether it's a student who thinks one bad grade means they're stupid, or a partner who assumes their loved one is losing interest based on one quiet night, or a professional who believes they're a fraud despite years of success. These thoughts can affect anyone. The challenge is not to eliminate all cognitive distortions. That's impossible. The challenge is to become aware of them, to slow down, question your inner narrative, and ask, is this thought helpful? Is it based on facts? Or is it based on fear? It's only when we begin to observe our thoughts, instead of blindly obeying them, that we start taking back control. So, ladies and gentlemen, remember this. Your brain may lie to you, not because it hates you, but because it's scared. Because it learned to protect you by distorting reality. But you are not your thoughts. You are the observer of those thoughts. And once you start paying attention, you'll see how often your mind isn't telling you the truth. It's just telling you a story. And the good news? You can rewrite that story. Our brain is an extraordinary machine, constantly processing, filtering, and responding to a world that is fast, complex, and emotionally demanding. To keep up, It creates shortcuts. These shortcuts help us react quickly, avoid danger, and conserve mental energy. But while they're efficient, they aren't always accurate. That's where cognitive distortions come in, not as glitches in the system, but as part of the brain's protective mechanism. To understand why the brain uses cognitive distortions, we have to first accept one truth. The brain prioritizes survival over rationality. It doesn't care if your thoughts are logically sound. It cares if they feel safe, if they help you avoid discomfort, and if they reduce emotional risk. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Imagine early humans living in dangerous environments. A rustle in the bushes could be just the wind, or it could be a predator. The brain learned to overreact, to assume the worst, because it was safer to make a false alarm than to miss a real threat. That same survival instinct exists in us today. But instead of predators, we now fear judgment, failure, rejection, and emotional pain. And the brain continues to exaggerate, assume, and distort, all in the name of protection. For example, take a person who experienced repeated criticism in childhood. To survive emotionally, their brain may have developed a habit of expecting judgment, even in neutral or supportive situations. Over time, this leads to distortions like, everyone thinks I'm not good enough, or if I make one mistake, they'll hate me. These aren't random thoughts. They're patterns created by a brain that learned to anticipate pain before it happens. Another reason the brain clings to distortions is emotional efficiency. Rational thinking takes time, effort, and reflection, but cognitive distortions are automatic. They happen in milliseconds. You don't stop to analyze. Your brain delivers a safe thought instantly, even if it's exaggerated or false. It's faster to think, I'm going to fail, so I shouldn't even try, than to work through your fear of failure and question whether that fear is realistic. So the distortion becomes a shortcut to emotional avoidance. There's also a strong link between past experiences and present distortions. Our brains store emotional memories in a way that's not always conscious. If something painful happened before, the mind quietly sets a mental alarm for similar situations. You might not remember the original moment, but your brain does, and it reacts. That's why someone who has once abandoned may become hypersensitive to silence or distance, interpreting it as a sign of rejection, even when it isn't. It's not about logic. It's about memory and defense. Moreover, cognitive distortions give us a sense of control, even if it's false. Believing it's all my fault might feel painful, but it gives the illusion that if you behave perfectly, you can avoid pain in the future. This is often seen in people who blame themselves for things beyond their control. The distortion becomes a coping strategy, even though it leads to guilt and low self-worth. Another example is black and white thinking. The brain doesn't like ambiguity. It's more comfortable labeling things as good or bad, success or failure, right or wrong. That certainty, even if extreme, reduces anxiety. But life is rarely that binary. When you rely too much on these extremes, you miss the nuances, and that's where misperception takes root. Even emotions play a role. Strong emotions, especially fear, anger, shame, or sadness, can override rational thinking. When these emotions are activated, the brain becomes reactive. It scans the environment for threats, even where none exist. That's when distortions like catastrophizing or mind reading appear. You assume the worst. You expect rejection. You predict failure, all because your emotional state tells the brain something's wrong. And the brain, trying to help, offers you a distorted thought to explain that feeling. The key point is this: the brain doesn't use cognitive distortions to hurt you. It uses them to protect you, to keep you safe from pain, to give you certainty, to shield you from risk. But the price of that protection is often distorted perception. And that distorted perception leads to anxiety, insecurity, broken communication, and poor decision-making. Over time, if these distortions go unchecked, they become part of your identity. You no longer say, I'm thinking negatively. You say, that's just who I am. But that's not true. These are mental habits, not fixed realities. The brain may use them to survive, but you have the ability to become aware, challenge them, and rewire those patterns. Recognizing why the brain uses these distortions isn't about blaming your mind. It's about understanding it. Once you understand that your brain's lies are actually protective strategies, you begin to develop self-compassion. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin to ask, "What is my brain trying to protect me from?" And that single shift from judgment to curiosity is where real change begins. The mind, though incredibly powerful, doesn't always function like a perfectly logical machine. It often relies on mental shortcuts and emotional filters, many of which aren't rational, but instead shaped by fear, habit, and past experience. These shortcuts become what we call cognitive distortions. And while there are many types, some are far more common than we realize, quietly influencing how we see ourselves, others, in the world. Let's begin with one of the most widespread patterns: all or nothing thinking. This is when your brain evaluates life in extreme black and white categories. If something isn't perfect, it's a total failure. If someone doesn't love you unconditionally, they must not care at all. There's no middle ground. For example, if a student receives an 89 instead of a 90, they might feel like they failed completely, even though they performed well. This type of thinking leaves no room for progress, growth, or complexity. It demands perfection and punishes anything less. Closely related to this is overgeneralization. It happens when your brain takes one event, often a painful one, and turns it into a broad, permanent rule. If someone hurts you once, your brain may say, "People can't be trusted." If you were rejected after a job interview, it might conclude, "I'll never be successful." One moment becomes a blueprint for all future expectations. It's as if the brain forgets that one experience doesn't define an entire pattern. But in a distorted state, it assumes that history will always repeat itself. Another powerful distortion is called mental filtering. This occurs when your brain fixates on a single negative detail while ignoring the positives. Imagine someone gives a presentation and receives mostly positive feedback, but one person offers a small critique. Instead of focusing on the 90% praise, the mind zooms in on the 10% criticism. That single moment plays on repeat, drowning out everything else. This filter feeds insecurity, amplifies self-doubt, and creates a distorted reality where only negativity feels valid. Then there's discounting the positive, a distortion that often works hand in hand with mental filtering. In this pattern, even when good things happen, the brain refuses to accept them as meaningful. Compliments are brushed off. Successes are attributed to luck. If someone says you did a great job, you might respond, "They were just being nice," or "wasn't really that good." The brain rejects any evidence that challenges its negative self-image. And in doing so, it maintains a distorted identity rooted in inadequacy. Let's talk about catastrophizing, one of the most emotionally exhausting distortions. This is when your brain automatically assumes the worst-case scenario in every situation. A small headache becomes a sign of a serious illness. A delayed reply from a loved one turns into a fear that they're pulling away. The distortion exaggerates the consequences of ordinary events, creating intense anxiety and a constant sense of dread. Even when nothing is wrong, the mind is preparing for disaster. This constant state of imagined crisis can be mentally paralyzing. Another subtle but damaging distortion is mind reading. This occurs when the brain assumes it knows what others are thinking, and those thoughts are always negative. If someone is quiet, the mind decides they're angry or disappointed. If a friend cancels plans, you might assume they're losing interest in the relationship. What's dangerous about mind reading is that it rarely involves real communication. It's based entirely on assumptions, which leads to misunderstandings and emotional isolation. Instead of asking or clarifying, we let imagined beliefs control how we feel. Personalization is another distortion that many people carry, often without realizing it. This is when you believe that everything is somehow your fault, even things that are clearly beyond your control. If someone is upset, you assume it's because of something you did. If plans change, you believe it a reflection of your value. This kind of thinking leads to unnecessary guilt and emotional burden. The mind becomes hyper-responsible, always scanning for mistakes, always trying to fix what was never broken by you in the first place. Another variation of this is emotional reasoning. This happens when the brain treats emotions as facts. If you feel anxious, your mind concludes that something bad must be happening. If you feel like a failure, it means you are one. But feelings are not always accurate indicators of reality. They're influenced by many factors: mood, memory, hormones, environment. Yet in emotional reasoning, the mind gives them total authority. It believes emotion first and looks for facts second. If at all, labeling is another common trap. It's when you reduce yourself or others to a single, harsh identity. You don't say, "I made a mistake." You say, "I'm a failure." You don't think, "They acted selfishly." You say, "They're a terrible person." Labeling eliminates context. It takes a moment, a behavior, or flaw, and turns it into a permanent identity. Once those labels are internalized, they become hard to shake. They influence how you view yourself, how you interact with others, and how you expect life to unfold. Each of these distortions operates quietly, often beneath our awareness. But their impact is anything but quiet. They influence how we handle challenges, how we relate to others, how we define success, and how we see ourselves when we're alone. They turn temporary experiences into permanent conclusions. They reshape reality, and we don't even realize it's happening. But the first step toward healing is naming them, because once you name a distortion, it starts to lose its power. You begin to create space between the thought and the truth, and in that space lies the possibility of clarity, growth, and a more honest connection with the world around you. Distorted thinking isn't just a psychological concept. It's a daily reality for millions of people, and its consequences don't stay in the mind. They show up in our relationships, our careers, our self-image, and even in how we respond to love, failure, and opportunity. What begins as a simple thought, quiet and unnoticed, can snowball into choices, habits, and patterns that shape the entire direction of our lives. Imagine a young woman who often falls into the trap of emotional reasoning. She feels inadequate in social settings, even when no one is actually judging her. But because those feelings feel real, she starts to avoid gatherings, decline invitations, and pull back from friendships. Over time, her world shrinks. Not because people rejected her, but because her thoughts convinced her that they would. Or take the example of a student who overgeneralizes. One poor grade leads him to conclude, "I'm just not smart enough." That one belief chips away at his confidence. He starts avoiding difficult assignments, doubts his capabilities during exams, and even considers giving up on his future goals. All because of a single event that his brain misinterpreted and turned into a lifelong conclusion. This is the silent danger of cognitive distortions. They don't need to shout to have an effect. They whisper consistently, quietly, and that's enough. Over time, these distorted thoughts create emotional exhaustion. The person feels constantly on edge, unsure of themselves, overly sensitive to criticism, or terrified of making even the smallest mistake. And because distorted thinking is so automatic, they rarely pause to ask, is this really true? In relationships, these patterns can be especially destructive. Take mind reading, for example. When someone assumes they know what their partner is thinking, "He must be disappointed in me," or "She probably doesn't love me anymore." Without any real evidence, it creates distance. Instead of talking openly, the person begins to pull away, act defensive, or shut down emotionally. The partner, in turn, feels confused or rejected. What began as a false thought becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, all because of distortion when unchallenged. Labeling also plays a big role in how we relate to others. When we reduce people to one-word identities, toxic, selfish, weak, we close the door to empathy. We stop seeing their complexity, their growth, their reasons. We define them by one action, one moment, or one flaw, and never look beyond it. And when we label ourselves, "I'm a failure, I'm broken, I'm unlovable," we reinforce shame, which is one of the most paralyzing emotions a person can carry. In the workplace, cognitive distortions often appear through personalization and catastrophizing. A manager gives neutral feedback. An employee internalizes it as a sign of failure. "I must be letting everyone down. I'm probably on the verge of getting fired." Even though nothing was said to suggest that, the mind fills in the blanks. The stress increases, performance drops, and burnout sets in, not because of reality, but because of the brain's fearful interpretation of it. These patterns can also limit a person's willingness to take healthy risks. Someone may have a dream to start a business, switch careers, or speak in public. But if they've internalized distorted thoughts like, I always mess things up, or people will laugh at me, they talk themselves out of action before they even begin. The distortion acts like a mental prison, locking away potential before it has a chance to grow. What's most tragic is that many people blame themselves for the outcomes created by these distortions. They think they're weak, lazy, overly emotional, or broken. In reality, their brain has simply been running outdated protective scripts that once served a purpose but are now holding them back. They don't need to be harder on themselves. They need awareness, compassion, and better tools to challenge the false narratives they believe for too long. Cognitive distortions can even affect physical health. Chronic stress caused by anxious, negative, or exaggerated thinking patterns increases the body's cortisol levels. This leads to sleep problems, weakened immunity, and increased vulnerability to illnesses. The mind and body are deeply connected, and when the mind is trapped in cycles of distorted thought, the body suffers too. But perhaps the most painful effect of distorted thinking is how it robs people of joy. Even when something good happens, an achievement, a compliment, a moment of peace, the mind filters it through doubt. I got lucky, it says. They don't really mean it. It won't last. So the joy never fully lands. It's always questioned, always muted. And over time, people stop expecting good things at all. This is why understanding and addressing distorted thinking is not just a mental health issue. It's a life issue, because our thoughts shape our feelings, and our feelings shape our actions, and our actions shape our reality. One distorted belief can influence dozens of decisions, and those decisions can either build a life we love or quietly destroy the one we have. The truth is, distorted thoughts are not signs of failure. They're signs that the mind is trying to protect itself, often using outdated or exaggerated tools. But protection at the cost of truth is still harm. And healing begins the moment we pause, notice a thought, and say, wait, is this actually true? Or is it just a story my brain is used to telling me? With practice, awareness grows. And with awareness comes choice. The choice to believe something better, something honest, something kind. One of the most powerful skills a person can develop is the ability to pause and notice what their mind is saying. Not every thought is true, and not every belief is helpful. Yet many people live on autopilot, reacting to distorted thinking as if it's fact. Recognizing and challenging these distortions is not about forcing positivity. It's about bringing clarity into the conversation you have with yourself. Every day, in quiet moments, in moments of doubt, or when emotions feel louder than reason, the first step in recognizing distorted thoughts is awareness. You can't challenge a pattern you don't see. So, it starts with paying attention, noticing the tone of your thoughts, especially in emotionally charged situations. The goal is to catch yourself in the act of thinking in extremes, making assumptions, or exaggerating outcomes. This takes practice, but the more you observe your inner dialogue, the more patterns begin to emerge. Ask yourself questions like, what am I telling myself right now? Or, is this thought helping me or hurting me? Thoughts such as, I always mess things up, they're probably judging me. Or if I fail, everything will fall apart are red flags. These are not neutral thoughts. They carry weight, emotion, and often fear. That's your cue to slow down and question the thought, rather than immediately reacting to it. The second step is labeling the distortion. Is it black and white thinking? Are you overgeneralizing based on one experience? Are you catastrophizing the outcome before anything has even happened? Giving the distortion a name helps create distance. It shifts you from being inside the thought to being an observer of it. You're no longer trapped. You're analyzing. And that's where empowerment begins. Let's say you have a job interview and the thought pops up, I'm going to fail just like last time. That's overgeneralization. Once you recognize it, you can begin to challenge it by asking, what evidence do I have for this belief? What are the chances this thought is accurate? Or, is there another way to look at this? Maybe last time was a failure. It was a learning experience. Maybe you've grown since then. Maybe the thought isn't fact. It's fear in disguise. Challenging cognitive distortions doesn't mean arguing with your mind aggressively. It means responding with gentle logic, curiosity, and compassion. Instead of saying, I shouldn't think this way, try saying, it makes sense that I'm thinking this, but let's see if it holds up. That tone matters. It makes your inner world less hostile and more reflective. Another powerful technique is reality testing. This involves checking your assumptions against real-life facts. If you believe someone is angry at you because they didn't reply quickly, test that belief. Ask yourself, have they acted differently toward me? Could there be another reason for the delay? Did I actually do something wrong? Or am I filling the blanks with fear? More often than not, your first emotional interpretation is incomplete or flat out false. It's also helpful to imagine giving advice to a friend. If a friend came to you and said, I'm such a failure because I made a mistake, would you agree with them? Or would you remind them of their strengths, their progress, and the fact that one moment doesn't define a person? Speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love creates space for fairness and compassion, something distortions usually block. Keeping a thought journal can be a simple but transformative practice. Write down your negative or anxious thoughts as they come. Then try to identify the distortion and reframe it. For example, the thought, nobody cares about me, might be identified as mind reading and emotional reasoning. A more balanced thought could be, I feel lonely right now, but that doesn't mean nobody cares. Feelings aren't facts. By writing it out, you train your mind to slow down and think differently over time. Replacing distorted thoughts with healthier alternatives doesn't mean pretending everything is fine. It means building mental flexibility. Instead of I'm going to fail, you might say, I might struggle, but I'm capable of learning. Instead of they're ignoring me, you might say, maybe they're busy, I'll check in later. These aren't delusions. They're balanced, realistic alternatives that help you stay grounded. And like with any skill, progress takes time. Cognitive distortions don't disappear overnight. You may catch yourself falling into the same patterns again and again, and that's okay. The goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to notice a little sooner, to respond a little more gently, and to become just a bit more aware every day. With practice, something powerful happens. You begin to separate who you are from what you think. You start recognizing that just because a thought shows up in your mind doesn't mean it's true or permanent. And from that space, you gain the freedom to choose your response instead of reacting from fear or habit. Challenging cognitive distortions is not just a mental exercise. It's an act of self-care. It's how you reclaim your narrative, how you protect your mental space, and how you create room for healthier beliefs to grow. It's how you learn to trust your mind, not when it's loud with fear, but when it's calm enough to hear the truth. In the end, what we think shapes how we feel, and how we feel often guides how we live. Cognitive distortions, though invisible, can quietly sabotage our confidence, distort our relationships, and shrink the possibilities we allow ourselves to pursue. The most dangerous lies aren't the ones others tell us. They're the ones our own minds repeat until we start to believe them. But here's the truth. Just because your brain says it doesn't mean it's real. The mind can be mistaken. It can protect you in ways that no longer serve you. It can confuse fear for facts and emotion for evidence. Recognizing these distortions is not about fixing yourself. It's about freeing yourself. Freeing yourself from the limits of black and white thinking, from the weight of assumed failure, and from the exhausting pressure of perfection. Every time you pause and question a thought, every time you challenge a harsh inner voice, every time you choose clarity over assumption, you reclaim a little more power. And in that quiet, consistent practice, you don't just change your thoughts, you change your life. So as you move forward, let your awareness grow louder than your anxiety. Let your curiosity interrupt your self-doubt. And remember, the brain may lie to you every day, but you don't have to believe it every time. Truth begins when we're brave enough to question what we've always accepted. And healing begins the moment we do.